Hi there and welcome to Ancestral Recall. This is a Magic YouTube show looking at the history of Magic the Gathering set by set. I'm your host, Eli Kaplan. Today we're continuing our look at Legends, the fourth Magic Gathering set released in 1994. Last time we talked about the origin and mechanics of Legends, and today we'll talk about many of the famous cards. We're going in Wooburg order, and hopefully you'll find some revelations about the game, as well as get some ideas for cubes or casual decks. Davenant Archers provided the first instance of a staple mechanic in white, range strike, damage dealt to attacking or blocking creatures. This often represents archery or ballista, as in the case of the most popular range strike card in cubes, Heavy Ballista. Now, here in Legends we get some vaguely French-sounding archers with an incredibly high cost, too high to be viable, but this card paved the way for many more white range strikers. Note that red also gets a similar card at rare, Crimson Manticore, but the fact that the Manticore flies and has better stats kept it from shooting all that much. I hate indecisiveness, and here is the only card in Magic that's custom tailored to drag matches into draws, Divine Intervention. For 8 mana, you get a 2-turn window to survive, and then can withdraw from the game. It's definitely a unique condition for ending the game, the Planeswalker making a strategic withdrawal, but in my book, this is a deeply unsatisfying card. Now, here's a historic card. Every so often, we get a card in white that harasses opponents by tapping down their permanents when they come into play. Thalia, Heretic Cathar, is the most recent in this family, tapping down creatures and non-basic lands. But the first was Kismet, a 3W enchantment that brought all opponents' permanents into play tapped. Note that this has been reworded to affect all of your opponents, with the original being quite ambiguous. Now, Kismet was a common partner in Stasis decks, giving opponents very few methods of breaking the lock. Superior versions of this card have been printed, but Kismet is definitely a novel effect, and this is definitely one of the best card names in Magic, if you ask me. Here's another groundbreaking card. Most card advantage engines don't come with the cost of just 1 mana, but land tax defies expectations. Originally designed as a counter to land destruction strategies, and yeah, it works, but land tax soon got used as a way to thin your deck and provide lots of discard fodder for players who didn't mind staying under their opponent's land count. Legends Land's Edge and its more versatile successor, Tempest Seismic Assault, combo with land tax handily. Many early combo decks were based on these types of combos. Borborygmos Enraged also wouldn't mind if some bureaucrats happen to ally with him. And if all you want to do is thin your deck over time and are fine with just discarding all those extra cards, well, land tax still does a stellar job of just that. Variants of land tax include Vision's Tithe and Onslaught's Weathered Wayfarer. One of the most expensive enchantments in Magic is Moat. I'm not talking about mana cost, I'm talking about financially. Now, the effect's very simple, but this card ended up on the reserved list for good reason. I mean, shutting down the opponent's points of ingress is very powerful in group games, and in Homelands they even printed a companion card, Mystic Decree, in order to make the Moat's protection complete. Now, with that said, Red and Black don't have any real answers to enchantments, so I think it's very healthy that we don't get this type of effect anymore, except in very rare circumstances, like Form of the Dragon. When old-timers like me think about lifelink, we often call it Spirit Link, the first card that allowed players to earn a player life by dealing damage. Yes, there is El Hajjaj, but that's just, he gets that ability, whereas this is a card that gives any creature that ability. Well, Spirit Link is more versatile than Lifelink in that it can take away an enemy creature's bite by gaining you life every time that creature deals damage. Lifelink only benefits the creature's controller. This card even got a callback in Planar Chaos with a black variant, Vampiric Link. And yes, that effect made people scratch their heads there too. Blue got a number of staple effects printed here for the first time that made it into numerous core sets. We're talking very staple abilities. Let's cover a bunch of them quickly. Boomerang is a powerful upgrade to ABUs on summon, though at double the cost, and requiring UU makes it far less splashable. These days, we get the land-friendlier Disperse at 1U, since the most frustrating tempo play was bouncing opponents' lands back to their hands. Another brutal blue spell is Force Spike, the most versatile one-mana counterspell. I initially dismissed it when it came out, since with spells like Soul Ring flying around, mana was a far less regimented affair. But in tempo-driven formats, as many Pro Tours have borne out, a Force Spike in the opening hand is always golden. Kenji Tsumura's response to an Olivier Ruel Duress is one of the greatest tactical plays ever, letting the Duress resolve, but keeping Olivier's turn 2 options much more limited, thus giving him a major stab back at tempo. Flash Counter and Remove Soul were cheap, narrow counterspells that got numerous reworkings in core sets, the former now being known as the perennial staple Negate. And honestly, all these counterspell variants, well, they sucked up a lot of the room for future design space and the namespace, but over time, designers came up with good variants. Now that we've got the typical blue effects out of the way, let's move on to the weird stuff. First, we get an H.P. Lovecraft reference, Elder Spawn. For 4 UUU, this 6/6 fatty gets a decent evasion and has an upkeep cost that isn't too hard to pull off. The art doesn't reveal that much, but honestly, with Elder Gods like this, do you even want to know what it's looked like? No, you don't. I would have appreciated some flavor text here, though. For 2U, Blue gets another surprising ability with In the Eye of Chaos, the ability to force instants and sorceries to be paid for twice or have them countered. While Blue's patented counter magic obviously doesn't care for this is a great alternative for Blue decks to answer red burn decks. And as a world enchantment, okay, there were other ways of getting rid of this problem enchantment. This was an early attempt at making taxing a blue effect, but today, taxing is firmly in white. Invoke Prejudice, on the other hand, oh boy. Here we go. Now, this is a taxing effect that hits all opponents. For UUUU, a very peculiar mana cost, this enchantment forces opponents to pay double the cost of their creature spells, or those creature spells get countered. Things like Blurred Mongoose, well, okay, they don't get countered anyway, so they don't have to pay the tax. However, if you happen to have a creature that matches the color of their spell, they don't have to pay the tax. Now, this is a terribly unkind card in group games, obviously. Harold McNeil, the artist, is not going to be doing any more cards for Wizards, as he himself was outed as a white supremacist, and Wizards of the Coast is a company that supports equal rights and inclusive policies. So it's more than a little uncomfortable for me to see depictions of hooded individuals resembling the Ku Klux Klan here. I can appreciate McNeil's work on the Tempest Circles of Protections, but yeah, I'm not sorry that he's gone. Juxtapose for 3U is the first card to let players exchange permanents, calling for an exchange of creatures as well as artifacts if able. Now, the same effect was also available for all colors and legends, thanks to Gauntlets of Chaos, but it only let one type of exchange happen, and you could swap lands, and you had to pay 10 mana on an installment plan. Ugh. Now, donated effects are extremely rare in Magic, but Legends happen to have 2 of them. I discussed numerous blue staples earlier, but Mana Drain is just plain ridiculous. This uncommon counterspell gives you X colorless mana on your next main phase after you cast it, where X is the CMC of the spell it countered. This can do just plain ridiculous things. I play 1 copy in my Vintage deck, well, because I can't afford more at the moment, and I don't play a lot of Vintage. Speaking of which, I really need to get around to showing that deck off sometime. Meanwhile, yeah, Mana Drain is ridiculous, being costed in today's modern templating and development at GGUU. And Plasm Capture is the only time that Wizards has revisited this effect. One of the biggest problem cards in Legends was Relic Bind, an aura for artifacts that let its controller draining the opponent for 1 whenever the artifact is tapped. Now, couple this with Basalt Monolith from ABU, and you have a likely instant kill. Now, Wizards does print these from time to time in different formats. Splinter Twin and Pessermite, for example, or Saheeli Rai and Veldar Guardian. But Wizards did something that they would never do today to this combo: issue power level errata. Relic Bind got hit with a nerf hammer really hard by Wizards saying that it could now only target opponents' artifacts. So the infinite combo got shut down. And Wizards backed this up by reprinting Relic Bind with the new wording in Chronicles. Now, there are very few cards that got power level errata, but they exist. Wanderlust is a minor example. Basalt Monolith is a good example. And Time Vault is a major example. Anyway, Mark Rosewater has said that since there was a more recent printing with the fixed warning, that would be the final word as to how Relic Bind worked. Ugh. The name Leviathan suggests giant, massive seafaring behemoths. So yeah, a lot of players in 1994 were scratching their heads at the sight of Segothian Leviathan, a 3/3. Segothian Leviathan was the game's first natural island walker, which makes it noteworthy in itself. But it's a tiny Leviathan! Many years later, Wizards justified the small stats by explaining that it was a Leviathan-sized creature in Segovia, a plane that is famous for making things very, very small, like Lilliput in English literature. It took 20 years, but this beguiling mystery was finally solved. When it comes to bouncing permanents repeatedly, Time Elemental isn't the first repeatable tool. That would be Antiquity's Obelisk of Undoing. But that costs 6 to activate and 6 to replay each time and can only bounce your own stuff. Ugh, not worth it. Time Elemental can bounce any unenchanted permanent to its owner's hand for 4 mana. And if Time Elemental even shows up on the field of battle, well, its controller is going to feel a major paradox. Time Elemental got reprinted twice in core sets and strangely found its art and border on the 4th edition of the Spanish Sarah Angel. How this happened confounds me. Okay, I've got to say that the black cards in Legends are some of the coolest in the game's history, and many of them are patently unreprintable. First up is the Abyss, a world enchantment that forces players controlling non-black creatures to destroy one of them of their choice every upkeep. Repetitive gameplay aside, this is the kind of unfairness that Black excels at. I wish I still had my copy of this and that this wasn't on the reserved list, because the Abyss definitely makes for great game stories, but I guess I can live vicariously through Magus of the Abyss, a much cheaper alternative. All Hallows Eve has great spooky art, as well as one of those odd timing triggers that helped inspire Suspend, and yeah, a very powerful effect. All the dead things, they're back! These days, this kind of effect is reserved for Planeswalker Ultimates, and you can get a lot of mileage out of Living Death, but it never hurts to try out the original. Frozen Shade is an underwhelming common from ABU, but back in the day, people loved it. And Legends tried to open up the pumping floodgates with Carrion Ants, letting other colors play with the concept of generic mana. This was one of the most expensive cards soon after the set's release, and the Chronicles reprint just killed the value of it. But decks just weren't that mana efficient at the time, and Carrion Ants took a lot of advantage of that. There's very little better at shutting down drawing abuse than Chains of Mephistopheles, and it's almost never in black. So, if you want to shut down draw abuse, you don't have a lot of options other than this. If you draw one card outside your draw step, you discard one. That's how it works. Now, if Wizards could reprint this, believe me, they would. Oh well, Cthulhu Fatong, Cosmic Horror, yeah. Now, this is the biggest creature in the set, and was the closest thing to an Elder One Magic had until Marat Lodge was unveiled in its full glory with Dark Depths. While First Strike isn't nearly as fearsome as Flying and Trample, and no, I'm not going to call that ability Flample, the Cosmic Core's upkeep could be satisfied just by tapping lands and not sacrificing creatures. Compared to Lord of the Pits, this was a form of progress. There is a black fog in Magic, Darkness. It even got a reprint on the time-shifted cheats, and despite that, Pauper has helped it hit a $7 price tag. Weird. Evil Eye of Orms by Gore is a big weird eye. What else could it look like? Is there a twin to this card? Okay, I've seen it. I can't unsee it. Yeah, Time Spiral let you play this along with its fellow eye in concert for maximum unblockability. I admit that, yeah, I got a playset back in '94 and trying it out. And it sucked. It did not work out. But seriously, though, this art is great, but the concept? Yeah, that's just plain oddball. The very first time Black tried trading life for cards, it was with Greed. For 4 mana and then each black and 2 life paid, you would get a card. It's surprisingly decent and limited, even if there are other cards that provide the batching for much less mana. But not enough people were willing to try it out, so Wizards decided to cut out the mana requirements and went with Necropotence. And Necropotence, well, the people who lived through Necro Summer will tell you that that didn't go quite as planned. I was a kitchen table player at the time, so I never felt the menace of the skull outside Extended. But Greed? Now, Greed's perfectly manageable. If you're a Johnny or a Jenny and want to see a simple card with tons of combo potential, here's Hell's Caretaker. You're welcome. Now, sadly, the timing restriction of only activating it on upkeep is aggravating. And there's a 9th edition reprint out there, so Hell's Caretaker is modern legal. Go figure. There's a Chronicles version as well, so this isn't a very hard card to pick up. As long as you can protect the Caretaker, he'll play hell with your opponent's chances of winning. I do like singing, but Disney is particularly persnickety in their policing YouTube for Content's ID, so I'm not going to start singing Hellfire. I will sing the Magic card's praises, however, and any card that can be a one-sided wrath in multiplayer games can be well worth it. And strangely enough, one card that ends up destroyed by this would be Hellfire Mongrel. Go figure. It's a flavor fail, but hey, that happens. The first attempt at printing a werewolf in Magic was Legends Lesser Werewolf. Players could reduce the damage it dealt in combat to give blockers -0/-1 counters, simulating the way that D&D werewolves did permanent, unhealable damage to player characters. However, such uneven counters were soon banished from Magic. Wizards took a few more stabs at printing werewolves, but nothing really stuck until Innistrad and its innovative double-sided cards finally got the concept right. If you love making opponents miserable and don't mind going through some misery yourself, you can tack on 3 mana to every spell with Nether Void. Thankfully, since this is a world enchantment, its effects can't be stacked with multiple copies. It also bears a staggering price itself, around $300 for a near-mint copy. Ugh, sheesh. There are uglier cards in Magic than Mold Demon, but this art, it doesn't do anything for me. Nuff said. Okay, now it's time to talk about a major evolution in Magic. Legends was the first set with a card specifically worded to consider multiplayer games Siphon Soul. In a regular duel, meh, drain 2 life for 3 mana, not great. In a 3-player game, drain 4 total. In a 6-player game, this is a 20-point life swing for 3 mana. Yeah, that's good. This card was the very first card in Magic to scale for multiple players, and explicitly so on the card. Now, the best version of this card for EDH would be Exsanguinate, because that's an X spell that can get really big, but we need to tip our hat to the very first. In ABU, there were a number of enchantments that dealt damage to a player based on controlling a type of permanent, such as a creature, a land, an artifact, or an enchantment. Wanderlust was the one that saw the most play because Cursed Land was a bit too pricey. However, Underworld Dreams in Legends decided to go the alternate route and do damage not based on an upkeep or on a permanent in play, but based on each card a player drew. This uncommon soon became one of the chase cards, as control decks could use Howling Mine and Brain Geyser to do lethal damage to players. Underworld Dreams got 4 reprints in core sets, a true sign of success, and still sees a fair amount of casual play today. Our last black card is the Wretched, one of Black's signature cards in the earlier days. What's the price for blocking this guy? Well, if you manage to survive, Eternal Servitude. A lot of players sought to exploit this with lure and regeneration in the early days. And while Mirrodin's Scythe of the Wretched doesn't work exactly the same way, that's fine, because the ability is much nicer and more cleanly templated and does everything you wanted the Wretched to do without the hard work. I'd much rather play the Scythe over its namesake, but we have to hail the original for what it does. One of Red's most famous early combat tricks was Bloodlust. This trick could get a lot of combat damage through and was often used as part of a creature rush deck featuring Berserk combos. Now, the other key use of Bloodlust was using it during the rarely seen but still relevant end of combat step after damage had been dealt. Current design space tries to push that particular element of combat out of players' minds, and if modern templating had their way with the spell, I wonder if they'd add a clause restricting this to being played before damage was dealt. We can only speculate. Lightning Bolt is an iconic red spell. In fact, it might be the iconic red spell. And Legends went to reprint it at sorcery speed with a weird reverberation ability at the same mana cost. And guess what? Chain Lightning was still a big success and got played in a lot of early aggro decks. Other spells that have similar reverberating abilities include an onslaught cycle of uncommons, including Chain of Acid, Chain of Plasma, and Chain of Vapor, and another oddball, Homeland's Chain Stasis. Chainer, Dimension Master, wants nothing to do with these cards. Chain Lightning is such a fun card that it got highlighted in Amonkhet's Invocations. There are only 2 Dexterity cards in Black Bordered Magic. Now, I own a Chaos Orb from Alpha. The one I don't own is Falling Star. Falling Star demands that you flip it on the vertical plane, not like a frisbee, from a height of a foot, or about 30 centimeters for those of us who use the metric system. And yeah, I'm one of the really weird oddball Americans who would like the US to adopt the metric system. Don't ask. Anyway, any creature that the Falling Star lands on takes 3 damage and also becomes tapped, because even if you live through the Falling Star, it still will stun you. Ugh, I've been stunned! This card is on the reserve list, which is an absolute shame because it deserves the foil promo treatment. This card is banned in all tournament formats, but that doesn't mean that you can't use it in Commander. Come on, pick one up and make a few memories. While Gravity Manipulation is now a blue and green thing, it used to be in Red's wheelhouse with Earthbind and Legends' Gravity Sphere, which shuts off flying. But I guess Red remembered about all the dragons and drakes it has and yielded this part of the color pie. The first aura to give a +X-X effect showed up in Legends with Immolation. My brother and friends used to play this all the time in the mid-90s as part of our kitchen table repertoire. Now, what does Immolation represent? Being on fire hurts, but being on fire also gives a creature a chance to do even more damage. Now, I personally prefer to use Immolation to deal with things like Llanowar Elves and Birds of Paradise, so I could save my Lightning Bolts and X spells for later bigger things. Now, these days, +X-X is much more of a black thing, like Emrakul's Gift. But it's very noteworthy to point out where this template started. I don't care for Spinal Villain. First of all, if you're going to call yourself a villain, you need a snidely whiplash mustache, or barring that, some kind of hideous disfiguration. But this guy, he looks perfectly natural and normal. Second of all, while I approve of red cards destroying things, if it's for killing a creature, I want to be it through direct damage, not just blah blah destruction. And while this guy can kill fish for days, the biggest problem with blue at the time wasn't its creatures. I guess doing damage based on the number of cards in the hand could be a red thing. Stormworld has a symmetrical effect because enchant worlds have a more dynamic effect in multiplayer games, I suppose. Yeah, there's a modest amount of multiplayer effects in Legends, but Stormworld, not that great. Last for red, but certainly not least, is Winds of Change. Forcing each player to take their hand, shuffle it back into their library, and then draw the same number they had before is definitely chaotic. In fact, Winds of Change might be the most chaotic red card printed to that point. I appreciate that this is a symmetrical spell, because if your opponent has a 2 or 3 turn game plan, this throws them off that. And yeah, this is a nice, cool, and cheap spin on ABU's Wheel of Fortune. One of the historic, iconic creatures in ABU was grizzly bears, a classic staple in old-school junk drafts. Grizzly bears were mana-efficient and powerful in an era when limited 2-drops were weak. And while Wizards has printed numerous functional reprints, as well as many strict upgrades, the first facelift of grizzly bears was Barbary apes. Wizards had an early fascination with gorillas and apes, which hit its high point with alliances. Anyway, okay, not much else to say about these bears. Moving on. You know, one of the weirdest things I've ever done on Magic Online involves Eureka. This 2GG sorcery allows players to take turns dumping permanents from their hand directly into play. Lands, artifacts, creatures, whatever. And yeah, that means that this works with planeswalkers too. When the player declines to drop something, the cycle ends. I've managed to play this on Modo and drop an Ulamog, as well as an Emrakul. My opponent was not happy. Eureka has had some descendants, such as most notably Show and Tell, as well as Alarin, a one-sided enchantment that lets you play creatures with converted mana cost 3 or less. Oh yeah, and Omniscience. And yes, all of these are classic combo engines. Here is a riddle for you. What is the smartest card in all of Magic? Think about it. Okay. Now, it isn't Niv Mizzet, no matter how much he will tell you otherwise. But there is a definitive answer: Floral Spasm. Floral Spasm is a saboteur that can choose not to deal combat damage if it's unblocked, and instead destroy one of their artifacts. Now, will this Spasm decide to destroy the artifact or not? Well, who's to know? Apparently this piece of cardboard comes with AI. Yes, okay. The controller of the Spasm gets to decide. This is just an example of famously bad templating. But the joke has to be made. Killer bees, Laszlo. We're talking killer bees. These bees are a strange variant of Black's Frozen Shade, coming with flying. So yeah, this card breaks 2 parts of the color pie. Killer Bees was one of the most expensive cards of the set's release, being one of Green's strongest cards, and the only green offensive flyer better than Scrib Sprites. But the Chronicles reprint just killed the value on this. And so if you're looking for a green cube card that raises eyebrows, there's little better than the attack of these Killer Bees. Living Plane is another oddity, a symmetrical land animation effect. This turns all lands into 1/1 creatures. Wacky! Of course, this was played in conjunction with small sweepers like Earthquake or Pyroclasm to clean up the board of lands and small guys, leaving your fatty to dominate the game. This card is an obvious nod to ABU's Living Lands, which only affected forests. Now, I consider this a strict upgrade to Living Lands in the combo department, but obviously if you want to send your team over for the win, this requires very precise timing. Look at the almost translucent skin on Pixie Queen. Yes, Magic used to print fairies in green, and occasionally blue, as in the case of Fairy Conclave. But blue took over this creature type hard, along with black as a secondary in Lorwyn. But the flavor implications of Pixie Queen, giving green decks options for flying, yeah, this is weird as well as overpriced. But the art is fantastic. Rabid wombat! Dun 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 dun. Okay, sorry. Seriously, my brother and I used to do that all the time when this hit the kitchen table. Rabid wombat was the first creature printed that loved being enchanted. That, plus the unusual element of vigilance allowing it to pull double duty, made this frothy guy quite the Johnny card. If you're trying to make a cube with auras as a theme, you gotta try this guy. There are better targets out there for auras, but none so wacky. Rebirth is a bad anti-card that might win you a game if you're racing, but 6 mana. Giving up an entire turn to cast this? No. Just say no. Oh, and Rebirth is symmetrical. Man, this is green at its most terrible. I mean, we're talking just a miserable design here. Yuck. Okay, now we go from a terrible design to a fantastic one. Green sometimes gets cards that allow it to manipulate its library or draw extra cards, and Sylvan Library does both. And many early aggressive decks sought to draw extra cards with this. I mean, pay 2 mana and 8 life, draw 2 more cards a turn. Yeah. And Sylvan Library has particular synergy with Abundance, which lets you replace all 3 draws and not have to put anything back. Sylvan Library is one of the most powerful green enchantments in Magic's history, and that's why it got a recent reprint in Eternal Masters, with cleaner wording. Another powerful green creature in Legends was Whirling Dervish, an uncommon which probably had slush art from Arabian Nights. My guess is the art didn't get in on time for the Arabian Nights set release, so they used it here. Now, this Dervish came with protection from black, so it could dodge lots of removal. And better yet, this Dervish is the first card to get +1/+1 counters whenever it deals damage to a player. This card inspired many others, such as the Slith tribe from Mirrodin and a bunch of vampires. The one that saw the most play in Magic's history is probably Innisrod's Stromkirk Noble. And if you want to see a terrible card, a rare, and a rare on the reserved list, check out Wood Elemental. Eating your forest for an XX creature, and only untap forest at that, is just plain miserable. Even if you're running just basic forest at 7 mana, you only get a 3/3, along with sacrificing 3 lands. Wedge went off on this card for good reason, and the art sucks too. Alright guys, I'm going to save the artifact and gold cards for next time. I thought I could get everything done in 2 episodes, but the more I dug into the set, the more I had to say. Oh well. In the meantime, thanks for watching this episode of Ancestral Recall. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment as to what worked or what didn't work, so that I can keep making a better, more informative video for you guys. And hit that like button if the spirit moves you. Or subscribe, and feel free to dig more into the past by checking out some of my other videos. This is Eli Kaplan for Ancestral Recall, signing off. Good games, and good luck.